I am always tempted to leave my colors and just mix back in because I'm lazy and I don't want to clean the palette. Well, I'm not lazy. I do a lot, but I am resistant to the cleanup time. I'd rather do the fun stuff. And I've always gotten kind of grouchy when it was time to clean up. So I'm going to be a good girl and make myself a good mixing place. These are the colors we used, and see there, that color has gotten a skin on it. So I really don't want to be using paint when it has a skin on it. I'll leave that over. I use this razor blade mostly because it is a good, when paint is dry, it cleans up really well. And you can see I'm still so thrifty. I'm trying to keep all this stuff, but we are still painting ducks, so the colors are still similar. I use an old catalog sometimes to clean my palette knife off or my razor blade off. I just stick the palette knife in between the pages of the catalog. This is an old U-line, and I basically just stick it in like this and slide it out. Same with the palette knife, stick it in, slide it out. The pages eventually get stuck together, but it is a good use for those. I don't use as many paper towels. I don't get it on my hands as easily. So there's a little tip for you. And then I take a little bit of mineral spirits, or if I have some old medium left in my palette box, and I just clean a good spot off to mix in. And really, my daddy and my husband both say if you're going to do a job, do it right. So let's start with the clean, semi-clean palette. I have a much larger box that's like a 16 by 20. This is 11 by 14, so I don't have as much mixing space in it, but it's a little easier and more portable than the large one, and it's easier to sit next to my easel. All right. I am using the same colors that I've used in all these studies. Titanium white, and that's pretty stiff. It's been in here about a week, but the clove oil has kept it moist. Cad red light, which I've used from this same pile. I had a broken tube, but I have plenty of that still left. Cad yellow and ultramarine blue. And these are some mixtures left over from previous duck paintings, the Koester painting. So I don't see those colors in here at all. I probably should just clean them off. A little bit of this purplish color may be useful. And if you have paint on your palette, you can always ask yourself that question, or you can choose to totally clean it all off and start fresh. That's probably the wisest thing to do. I may use some of these greens. I see these in there, and those are, again, just made from these three colors. So they're going to be harmonious and consistent. The main color I see, and I've toned my canvas, so I'm going to be letting some of that peachy color show through. But the main color I see, sort of the mother color, is blue. So I'm going to start with a mixture of ultramarine white and blue. And I'm going to hold my brush, my palette knife up, and ask myself, is that what I see? I definitely don't see it that light in most places. And it's not that bright of a blue. It's toned down with something. So typically, when you want to gray a color down, you can use its complement, or you can use a little bit of brown. The complement is usually a much more interesting color. So the opposite of blue would be orange. And I don't have a true orange here, but I can mix one up real quick, and that's already got some blue in it. Would be yellow and red make orange. So let's just put a speck of that in to start and see how that affects the blue. And that does gray it down. And since I'm using a peachy orange back underpainting or tone, it would make sense to put some orange in this blue. And that is closer to what I see. I like to mix at least 2 or 3 values of whatever color I'm working in. And I think some of the brighter areas on the duck, I could use a brighter version of this with less orange in it. So I'm going to go ahead and mix that right now with just ultramarine blue and white. And I want to have enough paint here to not have to go back, because I do see a brighter version on the duck that's not so dulled down. And I just think it's prettier. I also see in the shadow color, mostly ultramarine blue. And I'm going to come over here because I already have some of this mixed. This dark, dark, which has a little speck of red in it. And then a little bit of yellow in it. Let's pull it out with some yellow, which makes it greenish in some places. Yeah, right under the duck. As the shadow moves away from the duck, it gets greener. The green is simply ultramarine blue with some yellow mixed in it. If it's too bright, put a tiny speck of red in it, and that will dull it down, give it a little more organic feel for the greenery in the water. Could use a little bit more of that, so let me go ahead and make up one more pile of that. Ultramarine blue with cad yellow. Gives you this really viridian type of green. So let's put a little speck of red and see what happens. Oh, it should have been a really tiny speck of red. That's okay. Put a little bit more blue in it. Whoops, I had red on my palette knife still. All right, that's better. And to lighten it, we're just going to put a little more green, a little more yellow, I'm sorry. We may see that. So you only have 3 ways to go. If you put the blue and yellow together and it's too bright, you want to put a speck of red in it. There's nothing else to put in it to dull it. So it's a lot more simpler than we imagine. Now the yellow on the duck, there is again no pure white. So we want to mix up, first of all, the beak color, which is a yellow, with a little purple in it because it's a raw sienna. Now I have this already mixed, but I want to go ahead and show you again. We'll make a purple that is not too blue, because if the purple is too blue, it'll turn this mixture green. So we want more of a violet purple. That's almost like an alizarin. Put a little bit more blue in it. There we go. And when you mix purples, it's hard. Sometimes you have to put a little white with them to figure out what color they truly are. So when I mix this up with this reddish purple, we come close to getting a raw sienna. That's close. You could use a little more red even. Let's take half of it. see what happens with that. Put another little speck of red in it. Yeah. There we go. That is close to what I see in the shadowed part of the duck's bill. Now, let's pull a little more of that out. And we're going to get that pretty yellow ochre color. Just adding cad yellow light to that mixture. And we also want a darker version on the beak, which is pretty close to this. Might stick a little bit more blue in there. Whoops, just a little bit. Yeah, that'll work. So this is what we'll use more on the duck's bill. If we want a little bit brighter version, again, just keep pulling this down. And there's a brighter yellow. I don't see that exactly, but we have it if we want it. I do see that in the duck. So let's go ahead and mix up a pretty good little pile of that to use in the duck's feathers, in between his feathers. I don't want it quite so bright. Get a little bit more of this. And I do have this orange if I want to brighten these colors up a little. There are also some colors in the water that are a little bit warmer and yellowish. Now, the only thing left to mix is the white for the ducks. And I think it's pretty simple. We have green, we have blue for the water, and yellow for the beak and the areas in the duck. And then I have a little yellow on my brush. On my palette knife. I'm gonna mix up a warm white. And then, because I like to have several values, I'm going to mix up a cool white as well over here. So I can ask myself the question, is the light I'm looking at warmish or coolish? These are close to the same value. They probably can go even lighter. One more degree. Just a tiny bit of blue in it. Now they're the same value. But when you look at these together on the palette against the gray, you can see that this is a cool white, this is a warm white. And that's as light as we want to go on this painting. This is another one of Alexander Koester's paintings of ducks. He was considered the duck painter and has many, at least 50 paintings that I have collected of ducks. So he was quite an expert. This is just a portion, one duck out of one of his paintings. And I have toned the canvas, which I'm using this Stillman Byrne archival sketchbook. I've toned it with Zinsser and a little bit of peach colored acrylic paint, a light orange color, because I see some orange tones throughout the painting underneath, and I thought it would be interesting. The other duck we painted also had some orange tones, and I thought that would be a fun thing since this is an Alla Prima. I have vine charcoal and a kneaded eraser. I also have my tri-tip, which is a good workhorse eraser if I have an area that won't erase. I have cropped the duck so that his body falls down in this lower part. Not entirely. His face and focal point really is right here, left of center. But it's just a study, and I wanted to get the entire duck The only decision really I had to make was, do I show more above the duck or more below the duck? And since I like the shadows under the duck, and I like this bit of light that the peach is showing through, I decided to place him about that far. Now, in that position, I like to use a thin paintbrush to measure with. And so in order to figure out where to place the duck, I want to find a standard and ask myself, how many of this standards could I fit across and up and down? And the most natural standard to me would be the duck's head, from beak to back of head. 1, 2, and a little less than 3, and then a little more than 1 head tall. I can also fit, if I want to do it exactly the same, a little more than 1 head in front. So I'm not too concerned about this area of the canvas. I believe I'd like to start the duck about here, finish him about here. I want to have him about that much so I can get the shadow under him and a little more above. So let's double check and see how I can make that fit into 2 3/4 heads. Needs to be a little smaller. 1, 2 3/4. I'll move in a little bit. 1, 2 3/4. And then he's a little more than 1 head tall. So here's my cocoon for where that duck's gonna sit. I haven't really spent more than a few seconds figuring out how many heads wide, including the beak, and how many heads tall. He's about smack dab in the center. So, yep. So if I want to show more above the duck, I need to drop him down. I think I'll drop him just a bit. So let me double check that again. A little more than a head width, 1, 2 3/4, and his height was a little more than a head width. So that feels a little better. Can I include the shadow under here? I can include some of it. I also have a little bit of room for this lead in. I like the way the light comes in and hits the back of the duck. So that gives me room up here for this light piece. All right, so now I've made a space for the duck, a little cocoon, if you will. I've got a little more room in front than I do behind the duck because he's facing that direction. I've got him large enough that I can do a pretty good study. So now I can begin. Here again, I can find my halfway mark on the duck's head, which is just past the beak. So I know that just past the beak, this is the halfway mark. That gives me a good idea of how I would have started the head right here and not allowed enough room for the beak. So that means I've got to fit most of this head in this area, and it is an oval. Like an egg. There is another obvious oval underneath that extends further to maybe here. And these ovals do not touch. So that gives me an idea there. There's another oval. All right, so I added the elliptical shapes in Photoshop so you can see the size in relation to these ovals and how they intersect. You see that that one kind of comes at a little out from this one. I may or may not have that large enough. It's a little lower than the duck's head. And then it's not quite as low as this one. So that's about the right size. And if you get your hand going in kind of centrifugal motions, you'll get a better oval shape. Maybe a bit wider here. I added another circle here, because you can see a bit of a circle in the neck. Now this is not required that you use these circles, but it does help me to see the simple shape before I get into trying to do a lot of detail. And this one drops down a bit lower. And I'll go back to my original shot and come back in here and draw the actual duck, thinking about plumb lines and proportions and where things land. Get rid of that so it doesn't look like an eye. And even if you're drawing an orange or something, make yourself slow down and look at every single angle change. And I may come back in here and make some corrections, but here's that circle here that you see in the neck. Not a complete circle, but there is a hump right here that creates the rest of the neck. And then this one. See the front of the duck? And matching angles again. With everything you draw, you have an opportunity to think about the hands of the clock and how things are angled. It slows you down, makes you see and draw more accurately. The back, I can see the negative space right here. There's not much. It helps me to get rid of that kind of quickly. I had this top circle a little bit too big. So there is some negative space here where the neck goes in. And I can measure and see that the neck comes through almost halfway the oval of the head. Again, looking at negative space here. I'll follow this around. There's the back. Thinking about hands of the clock with these tail feathers as well. There. Now I like to go ahead while I'm drawing the object and draw the shapes of the shadows. And I'll start out with drawing the perimeter. I usually like to mass them in so I can see where the darkest darks are and the shadow shapes are. Beak to head, there to there. So that's about right. Let's double check it again. Here to here is the same as here to where the duck hits the water. And the nice thing about the charcoal is it's really easy to erase and the halfway mark from the duck's beak or bill is right about here. So I can come over here and find my halfway mark is about here. The halfway mark up and down for the beak is, I'd say, the bottom of the eye. So that's about right. And then there's a shadow shape on that beak. Lots of angle changes going on the beak. And then the eye. Yep. Then I could go ahead and define where these shadow meets light here on the back of the duck. Is about the halfway mark. Yep. Just a few little notes like that really shouldn't take you a long time. None of this drawing segment should take a long time. Got this little bit of light coming in there. And that's really enough. That's really all we need to draw right now. If your charcoal feels too dark and you don't want to contaminate your whites, you can take and just knock it down a little so it's not so dark. And just have a shadow left. Since I am using the Stillman Burns sketchbook, the pages are really heavy, but I use these chip clips, or you could use bulldog clips, to hold my page down while it's wet. I have last week's painting in here, so I put some wax paper, but I want to keep the page as smooth as possible, and these clips seem to help because they come along the whole edge of it. I'm starting off with my good old standby number 4 Filberts in a bristle type brush. This is again the Robert Simmons, and this is the Ivory. They're probably about the same in their hardness. This one's starting to get some paint built up in the ferrule, so I got to watch that. It's a good thing to soak your brushes in Murphy's oil soap when they start to get stiff like that. It means you're not getting all the paint out of the ferrule, and they'll get really hard and stiff. So these are my 2 primary brushes. I'm going to start with one for the background, and I did mix up the colors already. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and mass in some of this background. And the first strokes I put on there seem too dark. So as you're mixing, you really don't know until you test them out on the canvas. Now, I do like the orange background, so I'm going to try to paint kind of thin so you can see through. You can see some of that orange kind of glowing through there. Remember, we try to lay the first strokes in thin, especially darks, and we try not to do the coloring book thing where you stay completely in line with everything. And sometimes I just kind of set myself a goal of how long do I want to take to get this thing covered, and just to try to mass it in as fast as I can. Pretty thin and fast. It's more fun that way when you don't piddle with it. It's easy to get to overthink it and get too detailed with artwork sometimes. And think about your first layers going on thin. Just helps you go faster sometimes, I think, and not spend unneeded time on it. We have the drawing down, so you have an idea of where everything's going to go. Now it gets darker as it goes up in this corner, and that's a kind of a dark green. And there I just use the same brush. I'll have to be careful now when I dip back into the blue, because I want to keep my blues clean. So ideally you want to use a new brush for each color. So let me go ahead and get another brush out for the blue when I go back to the blue. And the bristle brush really keeps things very, I don't know, it's like a broom. It almost lifts off color. So you have to use a lot of paint. And if you start pressing too hard, you're just going to be lifting everything off. This might be a time that you could use a little bit of medium to get these darks to cover. I haven't gotten any medium out yet. I'm going to try not to. That way things will dry faster. But if I can help you with anything, especially doing something a la Prima like this, make a little deal with yourself not to piddle over it too much, but to try to get these areas covered as soon as you can, as quickly as you can. There's a little bit of dark over here. And I want to leave this area for some light to kind of come down in and dapple over the top of the duck. So I have a brush for my dark. I'm going to have a brush for the blue. And I'll also have another one for when I start in on the shadowed area on the duck and the light. Whoops. Can't talk and paint at the same time, it looks like. I'm not going to worry about this other duck, so I'm just going to fill that in with blue. Let some of that peachy color show through. Helps if your easel doesn't move so much. Probably needs tightening up. And then I'll go back to my dark. And the dark under the duck has a lot of ultramarine blue in it. A smidge of red. But both red and blue, both the red and yellow will lighten it up. So I want to be careful and keep it mostly blue under here. Probably would help again if I had a little medium. I like to use a cup, a bottle cap, or something to pour the medium in so it doesn't spread all over my palette. But it does help your darks to spread a little better when you put some medium in there. So. And this really is where your definition comes in. Don't worry too much because you're going to bring the duck's body back out. I'll come up here and put some dark. See how that medium makes it lay on there a little better. I've got something in the brush that's trying to lift it off. A little piece of dried paint. And I put that light blue in there prematurely. So I'm going to try to lift that off because it's going to contaminate my dark right there. Again, we start with the darks because there's not any white introduced yet or any light color, and it keeps your darks nice and pure and rich. And if you accidentally do like I just did, then you'll want to wipe that off so you don't make a mess with your darks. Now it goes more greenish as it moves down. It's cooler as it's right here next to the duck, and then it gets greener as it moves away. And it makes sense that that there's some blues and greens in the water. Maybe even brown. So if you're green, if you need to warm it up and make it more brownish, you're just going to mix a little tiny bit of red in with it. And it'll give you that brownish color. Again, I'm using a bristle brush, and this is one of the reasons I don't like the bristle brushes so much, because they're so aggressive. They start to wipe the paint off. But on this first layer, if you want to get your paint to cover well, and you have the good sturdy aggression of the bristle brush to get it laid in, it works okay. Then I usually move to a softer brush. And so maybe I'll mix up a little warmer color later for in there, because it does feel a little warmer. I have some of this reddish brown. It's got a lot more red in it. I might go ahead and put a little of that right there. And if this feels too bright to you, that's okay. We can adjust it. When you first put it against this, it will feel bright. Once we lay more colors in, it won't be as bright. All right, I'm going to move to the light area on the water. And I'm going to ask myself, does this feel cool or warm as a light? And it doesn't have a yellowish feel. It has more of a bluish feel to me right now. That's too dark. And I'm going to go ahead and use a little medium, because that feels thin, like a thin light. And when I'm painting water, I like to keep it thin. It doesn't read as good when it starts to get thick. And that lighter color goes down here next to the duck's head. And I'm in the blocking in stage, so don't worry about making everything look exactly like that. Just block everything in about where it goes. And don't worry too much about it looking exactly right. Put some of my blue down here. Want to get this thing covered. Come in over the back of that duck. And up here. Make sure I don't have a halo around the end of the duck anytime later. So work in an overlapping method if you can. All right, let me take and soften some of these areas together just a little bit. I got a soft filbert, and I'm going to wipe it, keeping my strokes, as we did in the other duck, horizontal to make the water lay down. You don't want to have any diagonal strokes right here. And maybe just zigzag it. Don't pick your brush up. That'll keep you from dragging too much color. There's a lot of brushwork up here. And remember, this is just the first layer. We may go back over it. It'd be nice if we don't have to go back over it. If we can just make this be what it looks like. I'm going to go up and down a little too. Reflections will go up and down. But then on water, I want to always go back in and flatten it back out. This is a little synthetic sable, and the ends are kind of separating, so it's giving me that. That might be useful somewhere. It's not really useful here. So I'm going to move to a mongoose brush that's more flat. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of dark. Come back in with the dark. And you see how if I start pushing too much with it, it'll start picking it up. It gives you a nice smoother, much smoother stroke. Same down here in the shadow area. I want to get these shadows really strong. And I want to make sure they're covered. They have kind of a liquid feel to them as well. And it's always nice if you can get it on right the first time. You don't have to really go back and correct anything else. I do like to vignette my paintings and give them an interesting sort of border. I'm going to work on them in this sketchbook. I don't know how to describe how to do that, but I kind of like having that illustrator look. And it might mean that I want to go back in and wipe some of this off on the bottom, because I brought it all the way down. If you have a good primer on there and tone, it should wipe off pretty easy for you. If I did want to frame this later and I tore it out of the book, I'd want to think about how it would frame up, what it would look like. So the perforated line is, if there is one, is right about here. All right, so now I'm about ready to start laying in the basic tone on the duck. Put my dark back in here. That corner is really nice and dark. And that helps feature the duck more when you have dark corners. A light area in the corner will lead the eye out. Even though I'm leaving this vignetted, I'm not vignetted, even though I'm leaving some of this peachy color showing through, I don't want the blotchiness to be distracting. There's a little speck of red in this blue to make it lean a little to the purple side. So, particularly over here. And if you get too much on this area up here that the peach is showing through, you can come back in and take some of it off. Let some of that peach shine through. That's the reason so many people work in oil, I think, is it's not only is it a beautiful medium, but it's forgiving, and you get lots of chances. Stays wet, you can wipe things down. Make sure you don't have a halo around this duck. So paint in. Okay, now I'm going to move to a new brush, a clean brush for the color on the duck. Actually, I'm going to use the bluish brush because it's a shadow color on the duck. So I'm going to use this one that already has the blue on it. And it has a lot of yellow as well. So I'm going to start with the darkest dark on the duck, which is a raw sienna color, between raw sienna and yellow ochre. See that on the neck. See some down here. Keep a paper towel in your hand to wipe. I see it also. Remember, the more you go up towards the light, the lighter the color should get. It's going to be darker down here. And then I'll move on into this yellow ochre color that I mixed, which is a lot lighter. And I'm just putting it about where I see it. We're going to paint over this, but there's a lot of yellow on the undersides of this duck. And I like to get it stronger than it will end up being, because once we blend and work, we'll lose a lot of that. Once we add the light color on the top and the shadow blue on the bottom, we'll lose a lot of that. So it's better to be bold with that color. Even working wet and wet, you can still afford to be bold with it. So a little bit of that yellow color out here on the edge of the shadow. Maybe a tiny bit down in here, the raw sienna color. Probably be better to use the mongoose brush down here because it's wanting to lift it off. If you're trying to get it softer, turn your hand this way. This is a very strong, aggressive pressure. When you flip it this way, horizontal so that you can see your rings, you're softer on your pressure. You don't pull as much of the paint off. All right, I'm going to move to a little smaller brush, and I'm going to lay the blues in. I always swish my brushes off because I put hand cleaner in them, lanolin cleaner, so they're usually dirty. I mean, they usually have that cleaner in them. I'm going to go ahead and put that in. It's really dark. Probably too small of a brush for this stage. So I've used up all my larger ones, so let me just clean one off. All right. There's that little light spot right there. I about lost that. And here's the blue along the shadowed side of the duck, right in here. if you'll go ahead and be thinking about the planes while you're putting these colors on. So here's the front of the duck facing this way. Here's the top facing there, and here's the side facing this way. So think about those three angles when you lay these brush strokes in. It starts about there. All right, then I'm going to go ahead and, well, while I have this raw sienna color out, I'll go ahead and pop some on the beak here, his bill. And I see a pretty dark area here. Maybe has a little bit more blue in it under that neck. It's a purplish blue. I'm going to worry about the eye right now. There's some pretty purple colors in here as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and move to the lightest light on the top of the duck. I have a little bit, the brush I'm using has some yellow in it. That's okay. The duck, the light on the duck is warm light. So I'm going to go ahead. That's probably got too much yellow in it, but I'll adjust it. I'm going to keep these separate right now. Top of the head. This little piece here. Tail feather here. I already have these colors mixed up, so a lot of people like to mix as they go, and you don't have to do them in advance. It just helps me to already do a little dress rehearsal on how those colors look. Now, I want to lay this piece right here straight down here, about like that. And think about the way the feathers grow. It's something we forget to do. All right, I'm going to leave the paint on that brush. And I want to come back in here and soften. I'm going to use this Filbert. And come back in here and sort of soften these areas together. And I'm going to wipe constantly as I do that. Because I really want to keep this thin. Again, I would like to see some of that coral color come through in some areas. And you know, a painting that's done in the Alla Prima fashion has a freshness to it that's hard to get if you overwork it. This is pretty pure blue here, and there's a lot of pure blue right here. The others are kind of blended colors. And you see I didn't leave quite enough. I didn't come and bring my background down quite far enough here. So I'm having to go back around it. Try not to lift too much of this off. That's why if you have enough paint on there, it is trying to lift off because the raw sienna color is really thin. So make sure you mix plenty of paint. You don't have to keep stopping. These have a kind of a yellowy green glow down here. And I'm going to move now to a mongoose because this is lifting off. I'm asking myself where things melt and where they are separate. I think that's important always. Everywhere there's a sharp contrast is usually the sharpest edge. And where things are in shadow, they usually have a lot of soft qualities, melting qualities. So I know this white color is too yellow right now, but I will adjust it. Solidify some of this. There's a beautiful light piece right here. And again, this piece here. A piece there. And some dappled light in a couple places over here. This has a speck of blue in it. Drag it over the top. Let's see what happens. Well, it's not turning green, so that's a good sign. And I think what will happen is when I darken the background a bit, because now that I've added the white, the blue doesn't look so dark anymore. It could stand to be a little bit darker and more defined. So while there's yellow underneath, the actual light on top of the duck is cool. And that looks better with the cool white. All right, I'm gonna stop for a minute, come back in here and look at the beak. It has some really bright tones on it. So I took a short break, and I went and photographed this stage, and I have placed it side by side in Photoshop and grayscaled it so that I could check my drawing and my values. It's much easier to see any mistakes in your drawing when you move the color out of the way. So the only thing that really jumped out and I measured is the length of the beak, and I knew that was getting too long. I shortened the size of the head, and then I needed to shorten that as well. I can double check it and make sure that I haven't gotten too far off, because the head was 2 3/4, and it was the same as this width. So if I shorten it just this much, I'm still 1, 2 3/4, and I'm the width of the duck. I think that's my only big error. Sometimes I'll leave the black and white up and work on that with the color as well, so that I can make sure my colors are right and my values are right. And at first I thought this light was just way too light, but I don't think it is. It's got some temperature to it. It's warm, and then I started laying some cooler tones over the top. And now I'm going to start chiseling some more of these different pieces together so they're not sticking out so much. For instance, this big white dot in the center needs to be reshaped and worked in. All right, so my phone cut off, and I did a few things. I mixed up some ultramarine blue and shortened the beak just a little, and ultramarine blue with a little bit of red in it, and I darkened this area and this area. I also darkened a little bit under the neck, and I'm blending it with a mongoose brush, which those are the best for me. When everything's wet and wet like this, it's very difficult to use any other kind of brush because it'll start lifting off the paint. So on an Alla Prima session like this, you want to make sure that you're not, once you've got it all wet, you're not using really sturdy, aggressive brushes. Now, I have this little piece in here that I really like, and I've had a hard time getting that to register. So it was likely just one brush stroke that he put in. And when you're working on copying somebody's work or studying it to see how they did it, your brush stroke may or may not look like his. So that's where sometimes you have to go back and do it several times. And I'm not trying to, this is not a study of brush stroke by stroke. There are artists who do that sometimes, and they count brush strokes in a Sargent painting. I've seen that before. And they really try to mimic the way the painter worked. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to just look at his colors and trying to get as close as we can in one setting with this fresh, nice, glowy look on this duck. And so you see how this, I've got some blue on the brush, and you can lay it over the top very lightly because it's so long, and it's soft, and it has a different, it handles differently when it's got paint on it versus when it's dry. So here is a dry mongoose. It's got a little bit of brush sizing in it. Sometimes I put that in there just to keep the paint from drying, from it getting stiff, but it's pretty soft. This is one of the original mongooses, but it's really good for blending. And you can see here that this value on the back of the duck's tail is almost exactly the same as the water, so it does disappear into the water. And I'm going to bring some grasses out over the top, so I'm not too worried about this segment. I was trying to get this reshaped because it was very, it was a big white dot, which it looks like that there, but mine was a big round dot. So I did come in and soften the shape of that a little bit. I can still stand to do that more. I have my mongoose that has a little blue on it. And remember, when you're painting wet and wet, it's a good idea to use a little bit stronger hue of paint when you're painting wet and wet, because it's needed to register over the top of another wet color. Again, this was just one of his quick strokes likely, and I'm piddling on it too much, which I don't want to do. So let me go back to the dry brush here. Soften that in because this is a really soft area here of just a warm tone next to a really cool tone on this underside. And you can see that the light changes right along in here. So you have all warm and then you have mostly cool with some warm reflections down here. Now I did go back in and I added a couple of spots here because there's some dark under these tail feathers. Anytime you're painting light like this, things that are really, really light, you need to have dark or it will not register if you do not have dark underneath it. So that's a huge, huge tip and lesson for you in painting anything. You want to have things underneath it dark enough so that when you lay these areas in, they register and they show up. And I've got the paint really thick here, so I want to soften it in a bit. And I can afford to be a little heavier on the lights right here, just to give it that feeling of feathers and some of the fluff and thickness of it. Also got a little too wide right here with my little blue mark, so let me squeeze in and push and pull. These feathers here could have a little more. And then there's a piece here. We don't know what kind of brushes he was using, whether they were flat, whether they were Filberts. We do know that old masters often used flat brushes, and they got really useful when they wore them down and were more like a Filbert brush. I still don't have this little piece right here that I like. So I haven't really made a spot for the eye yet, and as we learned last week in painting a duck or anything that is that has a skull and a socket, it's better to put the socket in there first. And I don't want to get too dark with this, so I've made a little spot there. I want to put a little indentation where the socket goes first. Smooth this out a bit. And then come back in with a small detail brush and pop in an eye. And it just looks like he's used black. I do have a little black that I'm mixing in with some blue left over. And I'm going to use a maul stick so that I don't lay in the paint. So I'm going to guess that is the halfway mark height-wise, and this is the halfway mark width-wise. And that would be the center of the eye. And a duck's eye, I have not studied ducks, so it looks like a little seed. It's not round. And there's no real detail like eyelids or lashes or anything like that. It's really black. All right, so I cleaned my brush off and I'm just going to reshape this eye a little bit. I want it to be real black. I don't want it to stand out too much. The beak's still not quite right, so I will work on that a little bit more. Like the main parts to this, I want to be right. And then I'm going to show you how to do some grasses. I may scrape some of those in and maybe darken the shadow under the bottom of the duck just a little bit. This is really light. It looked like it came first. This lighter piece on the beak. And then there's a more yellow tone. It's like a yellow ochre tone on the top. Right here. It's kind of almost orange. And then this is a little bit darker. Right here. Now this is standing out too much, so let me see if I can just pop some light back in there. Reshape this beak just a bit. Still not quite right, seems too long. Think about matching angles. And this seems still a little bit off. All right, now I want to put, and I'm going to use the mongoose brush, and I want to go back and put dark, as dark as I can get it to register underneath the bottom of this duck. And I'm using ultramarine blue and a little bit of red mixed in with it. And I'm going to use a tiny bit of medium just to get it to flow better, because that dark shadow is really defines a lot on this duck. So you want to go back in there and make sure you get that dark enough. When you put it in at first, it's really strong. Just take the edges and just kind of feather them out at the end, because you don't want any edges on your shadows to be hard. You see how wet and wet, especially on this sketchbook tablet, it lifts off really easy. So if you don't have mongoose brushes, you're going to want to use like those little soft pony type brushes, watercolor brushes, or something that's really soft. All right, let's do a few things on the grasses. And I did mix up some green, and I'm going to use a rigger brush. That's what sign painters use. It's a nice long sable type brush that you can load up and roll. And it's always easier to pull up with your stroke, and then it gets thinner as you pull up. And I like to start usually with a lot of medium on the brush, so that if I mess up, it's a thin, transparent piece that can be a little more easily taken off. And that this painting needs some texture to it, so this is working good. If you wanted to wait until this was dry, it would be a lot safer. There's some really nice brighter green up here. And I think I mixed up that ultramarine blue with a tiny speck of red in it and yellow to get a brighter green. Not registering too well there. There's more green up here on the top. And then there's some dark green coming in from the side over here. I think also down here this helps to kind of give you a feeling of perspective. So you've got grasses in the front, the duck in the middle, and then you have some background back here. And you want everything to be on the same plane. The last thing I really want to do is, there are probably a few things I would do to this after it's dry, but I would straighten out some of this, these feathers on the back, because they're really soft and smooth, and there's a lot of brush strokes in there. So I don't want to see quite so much in the way of brush strokes on there. And remember, you can paint really thinly. You could let some of that peach color show through. You could let some of that peach color show through if you wanted to lift some paint off here in a couple of places, because I didn't really do that. I painted pretty heavily where the duck is. So it wouldn't hurt to try that now with a clean brush. Just pull some paint off and you can see some of that glow. There's a little bit of glow here. Probably could have left some down here, but this is getting into shadow. So check yourself at the end and make sure that your areas that should be soft and melty are. And then your sharp areas, the back of his wing is the sharpest, and then the head is a little less sharp. This little transition here is a little too sharp. Your eye immediately goes to a hard edge. So out here the next morning, and just to kind of have a fresh look with fresh eyes. And there were a couple of things. This area here was bothering me a little bit. I didn't ever really get back to that and attend to that. I wanted to double check, and again, just look at it with a fresh eye. So all my strokes are pretty much going horizontally for the water, which is fine. But I did see some transitional tones here that were nice. And a lot of times when you put reflections in the water, you put the reflections in vertically. And then you come back along the edge sometimes and flatten those down. So even just those few strokes like that feel a little bit better than all this flat area up here. If I'm not sure, I'll go both ways and just kind of chisel it in. I would also kind of like to darken the shadow even a tiny bit more. My paint is not dry, it's tacky, so I could come in here and soften a little further without lifting it off. You just have to check the type of brush you're using and continually wipe it and just see. So much of painting is planning, checking at crucial stages to see how your edges are. The edge on this beak here could be a little softer. Could be a little softer on the tip. Oops, that might be too soft. And I did notice while I was editing that this area here could be a little bit wider. Now, do I want to get in there and fix that? I don't know. I don't know if it's that important. But you know, if you have a something as important as the beak on a duck, if you have that off, it can distract from the whole painting. So this little thing here kind of bothers me too a little bit. So it's too round. So I want to just come and kind of flatten the side of that out a bit to where it's not sticking out quite so much. There's a little yellow glow along the edge of this area between shadow and light. And I always try to make myself look for an unexpected color between shadow and light. Also, as I was editing, the feathers seem so yellow. And I've mixed up a little bit of ultramarine blue and white just to knock some of that yellow off. It is yellow here, but when I compare the two, mine seems a lot more yellow. So I'm just laying that on with a palette knife. Not everywhere, but on the tops, because the blue sky would most likely be, the water's blue, so we know that there's blue sky, would be hitting the tops of these. So I laid those on, then I'm going to go back in and just soften them down just a bit without lifting it all off. Again, the mongoose, long, soft mongoose brush works good. Doesn't press it down into the paint, doesn't lift off. And maybe I'll do a tiny bit more with the eye. It's probably a little stronger than what I have here in his picture. Again, this is Alla Prima, so these are things I probably should have done yesterday, but I decided to come back and again have a fresh look. There's no rule against that. While the paint's still wet, you still have a chance to fix things. And even afterwards, you can always paint over things if you don't like it. But don't piddle it to death. Don't. There's a little feeling of movement with this tail, so I don't want to lose that. Still tending to this little odd shape right here. And the thing is, on any kind of painting, if you can state something very simply with even just a brush stroke, it's beautiful. It's what we desire. It's what we wish we could always do without having to nitpick and strive over it. If we could just lay it in. And I think from what I've read about Sargent is that was his goal, to always state something simply, but to make it look effortless. And I do know that he would go back and take things off and put them back on and take them off and put them back on. So making it look effortless and it actually being effortless are two different animals. Now that's pushing that dark even more. I want to make sure my brush is soft to do this, because it will definitely start lifting paint. See how that just pops the value? See, it's doing that a little bit. I don't know what's on the brush. It's got a wild hair that's lifting the paint a little. Maybe just in a couple of areas that it's a bit darker. Not everywhere. This may be too blue. If it's too blue, I can put just a tiny bit of orange in it to tone it. Whoops, not that light. There we go. Just tone it down. It gets warmer as it moves away from the duck. I don't want to get in here and mess up my grasses. I could probably put a few more wisps of grass in here. I don't think I will, though. I think I'm going to leave it as it is. Watch the edges of your shadows. They don't need to be too strong. And lastly, I have this tiny bit of black. So with my maul stick, I'm going to pop just a little bit more dark in here. Edge of a highlight. He didn't put a highlight, but I like to do that. The light's coming this way. Oops, too much. The beauty of oils is they stay wet. It gives you additional window time to get back in here. All right, one final word on signing a study like this. You always want to give credit. If you were going to frame this and put this up somewhere, I probably would sign it right here with my name, but I would always put his name above mine. So and if the paint is wet enough, I think it would be great to just scratch it in. And I usually like to get really close to do that. And I'm just putting Koester Study. And I think I'll just put my initials. And that's fine, that's all. What I'm doing right now in this Stillman Burn sketchbook is on the facing page, I'm writing notes, or I'm going to write notes. I'm printing them off and sticking them in my sketchbook, and once it's dry, I'll go back in there and on the facing page write notes about the artist, what I learned, what colors I used, so that my sketchbook becomes more of a textbook and just helps kind of give credit where credit is due. So be sure you don't sign your name on any of these studies without giving credit to the original artist.